A medieval manuscript lies open under controlled light. The words are still there, dark against the pale surface, exactly where a scribe left them centuries ago. For generations, that was where the search began. In the language, the handwriting, the decoration, the marks of ownership in the margins. But the page itself was never blank material. It had a life before it became a book, and it kept absorbing traces long after the ink dried. Researchers are now beginning to read that quieter record without cutting into the page. Animals, workshops, movement, handling, and choices no colophon ever recorded begin to surface from the material itself. The unsettling part is not that manuscripts contain hidden evidence. It is that some of their most revealing history may have been sitting beneath the words all along. A parchment page can look almost weightless under glass. Pale, thin, carefully ruled, it seems to belong to the world of script and silence. But its smoothness is the result of force. Long before ink touched it, the surface had been soaked, scraped, stretched, dried, and cut away from its original form. Most parchment began as the skin of a calf, sheep, or goat. The hide was not simply preserved, it was remade. Hair had to be loosened and removed. Flesh and fat were worked away with blades. The skin was pulled tight on a frame, held under tension while it dried, and thinned until it became stable enough to receive writing. Too much pressure could tear it. Too little left it coarse or uneven. The craft depended on knowing how far the material could be pushed before it failed. Even in a finished manuscript, that earlier life was not entirely erased. One side of a page might be smoother than the other. Tiny follicle marks could remain. Scars, holes, and uneven patches sometimes survived into the book, forcing scribes to adjust their lines or decorators to work around an imperfection that began in the body of an animal. A page could be beautiful and still show where the material resisted being made useful. A large codex was never only a text waiting to be copied. It was an accumulation of skins, prepared to a standard high enough to be folded, ruled, sewn, read, repaired, and preserved. Behind its pages were herds, land, workshops, money, and institutions able to command them. Some books required an astonishing concentration of animal material before the first line was ever written. And when those books broke apart, when leaves were scattered or scrolls survived only as fragments, the skin beneath the writing could become one of the few remaining ways to ask what once belonged together. One of the clearest places to see this second history is not in a complete book, but in fragments. The Dead Sea Scrolls survive as torn pieces of ancient texts, many of them copied on animal skin, many separated from the scrolls they once belonged to. For scholars, the problem has never been limited to what the words say. It also concerns how the fragments fit together, which communities produced them, and how far the texts may have traveled before they reached the caves near Qumran. The writing answers part of that. Script, language, and textual variation all matter. But when two fragments are small, damaged, or visually similar, the surface beneath the ink becomes part of the evidence. Researchers have used DNA recovered from the skins to compare fragments at the level of their animal origin. Two pieces from the same animal or from closely related animals do not automatically prove they belonged to the same scroll. They make a proposed connection more plausible. Fragments, once assumed to belong together, may look less secure if they come from different species, or from animals unlikely to share the same production setting. That is the important shift. Biology is not replacing the text, it is pressing against assumptions made from the text alone. A fragment of scripture becomes, at the same time, a fragment of sheep or calfskin with its own material history. The scroll is no longer simply a literary object broken by time. It is a physical thing, assembled from animals, handled by people, and deposited in a landscape where preservation was never guaranteed.
The Dead Sea Scrolls offer more than a famous example. They show why manuscript biology matters at all. Sometimes the hidden evidence does not reveal a dramatic secret. It changes the weight of a possibility. And in fragmentary history, that may be enough to redraw the shape of a book. The difficulty with manuscripts is that the most useful evidence often lies in the object no one wants to damage. A parchment leaf may be unique. A fragment may be too brittle to sample. A famous book may carry centuries of conservation history, ownership, and devotion. The closer a manuscript sits to the center of historical importance, the harder it becomes to touch. Cutting into it, even for a tiny piece, changes the thing being studied. So the question becomes almost contradictory. How do you ask a page for biological evidence without taking part of the page away? The answer has pushed researchers toward methods that begin with the surface, where traces have already been loosened by time, handling, dust, and conservation. In some studies, the tool is almost disarmingly ordinary. A soft conservation eraser, or the crumbs produced during gentle dry cleaning. Conservators already use these materials to lift dirt from parchment without visibly harming the page. Under the right conditions, those same crumbs pick up microscopic traces from the surface. Loose fibers, collagen, proteins, skin cells, and other residues left by the animal, the makers, or later contact. What happens next is not one single test. Researchers may look for DNA, or they may study proteins, especially collagen, because parchment is made from skin, and collagen often survives when DNA has degraded or become contaminated. One widely used approach, often called zooms, identifies animals through patterns in surviving collagen peptides. It distinguishes, for example, whether a page was made from calf, sheep, or goat, without requiring a visible piece of the manuscript to be removed. The quiet power of this approach is its restraint. A page that once seemed impossible to test may yield information without being sacrificed. The manuscript is no longer merely protected from investigation. Its protection becomes part of the method, shaping the questions scholars can ask of the surface. A biological result can sound small at first. Calf, sheep, goat, a species name beside a page. But inside a manuscript, that answer rarely stays small. It begins to disturb the impression of unity created by handwriting, decoration, and binding. A codex is not made as one continuous object. It is built from gatherings, sheets folded, nested, ordered, and sewn into a structure that opens and closes. To the eye, those leaves may seem to belong together naturally. The script may run steadily across them. The decoration may follow a plan. The binding may make the whole book feel settled. But the parchment can preserve a different pattern underneath. One gathering may be mostly calfskin. Another may include sheep. A single inserted leaf may not match the animal source around it. A section that looks original may have entered the book later. This is where biology turns the manuscript inward. It does not immediately point to distant markets or broad trade networks. It first asks how the object in front of us was assembled. Were its parts prepared together or gathered in stages? Did a damaged leaf get replaced? Were older materials reused? Did separate booklets become one volume only after they had already lived separate lives? Those questions matter because manuscripts often hide their own making. A polished codex can smooth over interruption, repair, and compromise. Biological evidence makes some of those seams visible again, not by replacing codicology, but by adding another layer to it. Species patterns gain meaning beside quire structure, ruling, pricking, script changes, decoration, binding, and wear. The page becomes less like a blank support and more like a witness to assembly. Its animal origin cannot name every maker or reconstruct every decision, but it can show where the finished book may be more composite than it first appears. From there, the question begins to widen beyond the binding. Every prepared leaf had to come from somewhere before it entered the book. Animals were raised, bought, slaughtered, and skinned. Hides moved through hands before they became parchment. Someone selected them, cleaned them, stretched them, trimmed them, sorted them, and judged which surfaces were good enough for a gospel book, a legal register, a charter, or a scholar's working copy. That chain was never separate from the wider economy. A monastery with land and livestock did not approach parchment in the same way as an urban workshop buying skins through a market. A royal or episcopal commission could demand a level of consistency that a smaller institution could not easily match. In one region, sheep might supply the ordinary writing surface. In another, calf or goat might be more available, more valued, or more closely tied to local craft traditions. The species written into the page could reflect preference, geography, wealth, season, access, and institutional reach. Biological evidence matters here because it lets the book point outward. Patterns of animal use may suggest organized supply. Consistent material across many leaves may hint at planning, purchasing power, or a workshop able to control its sources. Sudden variation may suggest scarcity, interruption, repair, reuse, or a more flexible economy of production. The manuscript becomes the endpoint of decisions made across fields, roads, markets, workshops, and treasuries. Written culture depended on those systems more heavily than the finished page admits. The beauty of a manuscript can hide the number of animals behind it. The stability of a text can hide the movement of skins before writing began. A book preserved in a library may look still, but its materials belong to a moving world where animal economies and intellectual life were folded together into something durable enough to survive. The same traces that make manuscripts newly legible also make them difficult to trust too quickly. A page was never sealed after it was written. It was touched, opened, closed, kissed, carried, rebound, cataloged, cleaned, repaired, displayed, and studied. Every stage could leave something behind. The biological record is not a single moment preserved intact. It is an accumulation. That matters most when the evidence comes from the surface. Human DNA on a manuscript may tempt us to imagine a medieval reader, a scribe, or a monk turning pages by candlelight. But it may belong to a later owner, a librarian, a conservator, a scholar, or someone who handled the book only decades ago. Even animal DNA carries limits. It may identify a species without revealing the exact herd, workshop, or place where the parchment was prepared. A page can say calf without saying where that calf lived. The Dead Sea Scrolls show why this caution matters. A biological match between fragments can make a proposed reconstruction more plausible, but it cannot carry the whole burden of proof. A difference in species can unsettle an old assumption, but it still has to be weighed beside script, language, damage, and archaeological context. Biology changes the balance of evidence. Interpretation still has to do the harder work. protein evidence has its own limits. Zooms is powerful for identifying animal species, especially when DNA is broken down, but it does not reveal every detail of production. A mixed manuscript might reflect original assembly, later repair, rebinding, or the reuse of older leaves. Biology can expose a problem that history still has to explain. This is not a weakness so much as a condition of working with old objects. Manuscripts survive because they passed through time, and passing through time changed them. Their evidence is valuable because it is layered, but the layers are rarely labeled. The method does not make the manuscript transparent. It makes the silence more detailed. The manuscript, under controlled light, has not changed. The ink is still where it was. The decoration still draws the eye. The words remain the most deliberate thing on the page, the part someone meant to preserve and someone else hoped would be read. But the page is no longer just a surface beneath language. It is a remnant of animals, tools, workshops, owners, repairs, journeys, and accidents of survival. Its biology does not replace the written text, and it does not turn every book into a solved puzzle. The evidence is partial, fragile, and easily misunderstood when separated from the older disciplines that have always studied manuscripts as handmade objects. Still, something has shifted. A book can now be read for what was written into it, and for what happened to it. The quiet traces in parchment reveal that written culture was never purely intellectual. It depended on bodies, materials, economies, and hands. Ancient manuscripts are giving up DNA secrets, but perhaps the larger secret is simpler. The past was never preserved in words alone. Sometimes the most revealing history is carried by the page before anyone begins to read it. When the page itself becomes evidence, reading begins before the first word. Add your interpretation below. What does a manuscript become once its surface is no longer treated as neutral? For viewers who follow archaeology through the material traces left behind, this is Armchair Archaeology. And on screen now is the world's oldest dog and the real story of domestication, where another familiar boundary becomes harder to draw the closer the evidence is examined. Until next time, keep questioning, stay curious, and remember, a surviving object is never only what someone meant it to be.